I stood in my kitchen, my fingers trembling as I gripped a lukewarm cup of coffee, staring through the window at the absolute carnage unfolding in my backyard, where 50 complete strangers were trampling over my grass, spilling cheap beer into my flower beds, and diving into the crystal-clear water of my brand-new $45,000 saltwater pool. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, the physical manifestation of 18 months of grueling divorce proceedings that had left me emotionally bankrupt but financially holding $85,000, which I had poured into this corner lot in Cypress Creek Estates, thinking that the $285 monthly HOA fees were a small price to pay for the manicured excellence promised in the brochure. But then there was Victoria Sterling. She was the four-term president of the Cypress Creek Homeowners Association, a woman who looked like she was carved out of expensive marble and desperation, with surgically perfect blonde hair that never moved in the Texas wind and a white Cadillac Escalade that she patrolled the neighborhood in like a shark circling a reef. When I first moved into the house formerly owned by Mr. Abernathy, a sweet man who had lived there for 20 years without so much as a chipped paint complaint, I thought I was safe because my deed explicitly stated, "Pool installation rights included." But those 3 words were apparently a declaration of war to a woman like Victoria. "Get out of my pool now," I screamed, stepping onto the patio, my voice cracking under the weight of the audacity I was witnessing. But Victoria Sterling didn't even flinch. She just lounged on one of my designer floats, her sunglasses reflecting the Texas sun as she waved a dismissive, manicured hand at me. "Relax, honey. It's a community fundraiser. Didn't you get the memo?" she chirped, her voice dripping with that artificial southern honey that hides a sting of pure cyanide, claiming that all homeowners were required to participate in community events per the bylaws, which was a lie so bold it made my head spin. I watched as a man who looked like he'd been drinking since breakfast shattered my custom glass patio table, and children with muddy feet turned my pristine filtration system into a swamp. And in that moment, as the stench of spilled lager and entitlement filled the humid air, I realized this wasn't just a party, it was an invasion. "This is trespassing, Victoria, and I will sue you into the ground," I hissed, but she just smirked, that sharp, diamond-cutting smile that told me she had done this 100 times before to 100 other women who thought they could own something she couldn't control. She told me to good luck proving she didn't have community access rights, and as she drifted away toward the deep end, I realized that my survival in Sugarland depended on me becoming someone I didn't recognize, because the predator of Cypress Creek Estates had finally found a prey that was willing to bite back. The harassment had actually started months earlier, during the second week of construction, when Victoria appeared at my door at exactly 7:45 a.m., clutching a clipboard like it was the 10 Commandments, claiming that multiple residents had complained about the noise. I knew 3 people in the neighborhood by name, and 2 of them were the construction crew, but she insisted she had personally timed my workers arriving at 7:47 a.m., a violation of the quiet hours she had apparently invented on the spot. She dragged me into an emergency meeting at the Lone Star Community Center, a room that smelled of burnt decaf and broken dreams, where she allowed me exactly 3 minutes to defend my legal permits while her disciples, a group of neighbors she had terrified into submission, glared at me like I was a heretic. She delayed my project by 3 weeks by challenging legal permits, but the real rot was revealed when my contractor, a hardened man named Caleb Thorne, admitted that a woman claiming to be a community liability officer had called him, threatening that I would lose my house if the project continued. It was Victoria, impersonating an official to sabotage a private project, and when the pool was finally finished, she began her daily surveillance missions, standing at the edge of my property at 8:01 a.m. every morning, photographing my backyard from 17 different angles and scratching notes into her ledger with a sound that felt like teeth on a chalkboard. The neighbors started looking at me with pity, like I was a terminal patient, and it was only when Dr. Elena Rossi, our local pediatrician, and Captain Elias Thorne, a retired Marine who lived 3 doors down, pulled me aside that I understood the depth of the shadow Victoria cast over this place. Captain Thorne told me about the Miller family, whose lives she had dismantled over a fence that was a 1/4 inch too high, measuring it 23 times until she found the violation she needed to trigger a foreclosure. This wasn't about property values, it was about dominance, and my pool, a symbol of my independence after a decade of a suffocating marriage, was a monument to her lack of control, and she was going to burn my life down to the ground just to see the smoke. 2 weeks after the pool party incident, the war escalated from petty harassment to a coordinated assault, starting when Victoria's Escalade screeched into my driveway, followed by a man in a wrinkled polo shirt with a name tag that looked like it had been printed at a church basement social. "Riley, sweetie, meet Julian Crane from the Fort Bend County Safety Office," she announced, her voice sharp enough to strip the paint off my front door, claiming it was time for a mandatory compliance review because of safety violations and electrical hazards. This man, Julian, looked about as official as a mall Santa in July, sweating through his shirt and refusing to meet my eyes as he poked at my saltwater system with a rusty tape measure, while Victoria took photos of my electrical box like she was documenting a murder scene. But Victoria Sterling made one fatal mistake. She underestimated the research skills of a woman who had just survived 18 months of discovery in a divorce court. That night, fueled by caffeine and a cold fury, I started digging, and what I found made me laugh out loud in the silence of my empty house. Because Julian Crane wasn't a county inspector, he was a delivery driver for a mortgage company owned by Victoria's husband, and according to LinkedIn, he was actually her brother-in-law. The official violation letter they had handed me was dated 3 days before the inspection even happened, a smoking gun of pre-written harassment that my lawyer had told me was the holy grail of civil litigation. But the real jackpot, the thing that made me pour a glass of expensive bourbon and toast the empty room, was the discovery that Victoria's own massive deck expansion, built in 2019, had never been permitted by the city, meaning the Queen of Compliance was living on 400 square feet of illegal timber. I made 3 calls the next morning, one to the Fort Bend County Inspector's Office, one to the Texas State HOA Oversight Board, and one to the Sugar Land Planning Department, and then I sat back and watched through my curtains as a certified letter was delivered to Victoria's house. Watching her hands shake as she read that return address was better than anything on cable TV, and 20 minutes later, she was pounding on my door, her face whiter than her expensive SUV, trying to claim there had been a misunderstanding about her brother-in-law's fake badge. "Cut the crap, Victoria," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "I have the phone records, the witness statements, and the photos of your illegal deck, and if you ever step foot on my property again, I'm calling the police." For the first time in years, the tyrant of Cypress Creek was speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but then her face twisted into something truly ugly, something demonic. "You think you're smart?" she hissed, her voice a low, vibrating growl. "You have no idea what you've started, sweetie. This community has ways of dealing with troublemakers." And she stomped back to her car, but the chill that ran down my spine wasn't from the air conditioning. A text from an unknown number arrived 10 minutes later. "Check your homeowner's insurance policy. Accidents happen." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare. The grocery store checkout lines went silent when I walked in. The neighbors who used to wave now suddenly found urgent hedges to trim, and the Henderson kids were whisked inside as if I were a literal monster. Dr. Elena Rossi cornered me at the mailboxes, her voice a frantic whisper, telling me that Victoria was calling every parent at the school pickup, claiming my pool was a structural hazard that was going to sink the neighboring foundations and destroy the street's property values. Then came the emergency HOA meeting at the Cypress Creek Clubhouse, where 47 residents packed the room to watch what felt like a public execution, with Victoria standing behind a laptop, projected onto a screen with a PowerPoint presentation filled with red arrows and fabricated drainage reports. She had weaponized my legitimate complaints into evidence of my instability, claiming I was harassing city officials and threatening the well-being of the elderly, and one by one, her disciples stood up to testify about the construction noise that had triggered migraines and the safety risks that kept them up at night. I sat there, feeling the copper taste of defeat in my mouth, until Captain Elias Thorne stood up, his military bearing cutting through the room like a blade, and asked to see the case numbers for the city correspondence Victoria was claiming to have. The room went cold, the temperature dropping 10 degrees as Captain Thorne revealed that he had called the city, and they had mentioned an active investigation into inspector impersonation and were looking for the whistleblower to thank them for reporting a serious felony. Victoria's face went from red to purple to a ghostly, translucent white as the captain mentioned that the investigation was expanding to include unpermitted construction throughout the neighborhood, specifically mentioning expanded decks. She slammed her laptop shut and adjourned the meeting in a panic, but as I was leaving, she caught me by the exit, her breath hot and smelling of stale coffee against my ear. "I know where you work, Riley," she whispered, "and I know how to make you disappear from that office before the week is over." And I realized then that I wasn't fighting an HOA president anymore. I was fighting a cornered animal with nothing to lose. Monday morning, my world collapsed. My boss at NextGen Tech called me into his office, his voice like ice, telling me an ethics complaint had been filed claiming I was using company resources to harass government officials and engage in domestic terrorism. I was escorted out by security. 12 years of a spotless career evaporated in the time it took to pack a cardboard box. And by Tuesday, my pool contractor called me, sobbing that the Better Business Bureau was investigating them for fraud based on detailed, fake complaints. By Wednesday, my mortgage company, Greatwood Financial, sent a letter demanding loan acceleration, the immediate payment of $340,000 because of unauthorized structural modifications that they claimed threatened the loan agreement. I was sitting in my kitchen, the ruins of my life spread out on the counter, when Captain Thorne knocked on my door with a look of genuine fear in his eyes, telling me we had to go to the park because he suspected Victoria's husband, who had connections to private investigators, had bugged my house. We sat on a park bench in the humid Texas evening, and he handed me a manila folder that Mr. Abernathy's grandson, Tommy, had found behind a false wall in the old man's basement. It was the original HOA incorporation documents from 2019, and as I flipped through the yellowed pages, my blood turned to liquid nitrogen because there was a line item for a community pool fund that had collected $180,000 from the residents over 18 months. The money was supposed to build a pool where the playground now sat, but the bank statements showed the entire fund had been transferred into Sterling Construction Management, a shell company owned by Victoria's brother, the same man who had pretended to be the inspector. She hadn't just been mean. She had been robbing the neighborhood for years, using stolen community funds to pay for her Escalade, her kitchen remodel, and her illegal deck expansion, all while telling the neighbors the pool project was canceled due to unexpected costs. My pool wasn't just an eyesore to her. It was a physical piece of evidence, a $45,000 monument to her crimes that reminded every neighbor what their $180,000 could have bought them if she hadn't stolen it. The most terrifying document was a handwritten note in Victoria's perfect script, Riley Blake removal urgent. Pool visibility equals questions about missing funds. Acquisition by any means necessary. She wasn't just trying to move me out. She had already pre-signed a real estate contract with one of her husband's clients to buy my lot and fill the pool in immediately. And as Captain Thorne whispered that he thought she was planning a final solution for the upcoming meeting, I realized I wasn't just fighting for my home anymore. I was fighting for my life. The final act of Victoria Sterling's desperation began with a literal bang when I woke up Friday morning to the sound of chemical hissing, only to find that someone had poured 5 bags of concrete mix into my pool's filtration system, destroying $8,000 worth of machinery in a single night of vandalism. But Victoria didn't know that Captain Thorne's daughter, Jessica, a digital forensics expert from Seattle, had spent the night installing high-definition, infrared cameras that caught Victoria's husband and brother in crystal-clear 4K, wearing fake pool repair shirts as they sabotaged my property. By noon, catering trucks were arriving at my house again. But this time it wasn't a party. It was a siege, as 50 neighbors, whipped into a frenzy by Victoria's fake mental instability reports, surrounded my home, chanting for me to come out and face the community. I was trapped inside, watching through the blinds as Victoria took to a portable stage, microphone in hand, telling the crowd that I was a domestic threat who had been terrorizing elderly residents. And I could see her husband moving toward my gas line with a wrench and a red container that smelled of high-octane gasoline. "She's going to blow the house," I whispered into the secure channel we had established with Agent Sarah Miller of the FBI Financial Crimes Unit, who had been secretly building a RICO case against the Sterlings for the last 48 hours based on the records we found in the basement. Victoria's plan was brilliant in its cruelty. She would create a gas accident during a crowded community event. 40 witnesses would swear it was a tragic explosion caused by my illegal pool wiring, and my death would bury the evidence of her embezzlement forever. Come out, Riley. Face the people you've hurt. Victoria screamed, her voice amplified and distorted, and the crowd, good people, families, people I had once hoped would be my friends, were roaring for my blood, their faces twisted by the propaganda she had fed them. I could smell the gas now, a faint, sweet rot creeping into the kitchen, and as I grabbed my go-bag and prepared to run, the world suddenly exploded, not with fire, but with the deafening roar of sirens and the blinding flash of federal authority. 10 black SUVs screeched into the cul-de-sac of Cypress Creek Estates, and FBI tactical teams swarmed the lawn, their weapons drawn as they shouted for everyone to get on the ground. The sudden shift in power making the mob collapse into a sea of terrified silence. Victoria Sterling, Robert Sterling, William Morrison, you are under federal arrest for racketeering, insurance fraud, and attempted murder. Agent Miller's voice boomed through a megaphone, and for a second, Victoria tried to maintain the lie, screaming that I had bribed the feds to frame her. But then, Captain Thorne stepped onto the stage, took the microphone, and played the recording we had intercepted from Victoria's own encrypted messages. Her voice, cold and clinical, discussing the permanent solution and the gas leak, while the neighbors listened in a stunned, horrified silence. The energy in the yard shifted like a tectonic plate. The anger that had been directed at me for months suddenly pivoted, a tidal wave of suburban rage crashing down on the woman who had stolen their pool money and tried to kill their neighbor to hide the theft. I walked out of my front door as the handcuffs clicked shut on Victoria's wrists, her surgically perfect hair finally disheveled, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred as she was shoved into the back of a federal vehicle. The neighbors, the Hendersons, Mr. Kim, Mrs. Patterson, stood there in the wreckage of their righteousness, looking at me with a shame so deep it was palpable, and Mrs. Patterson actually walked up to me, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "Riley, we are so sorry." 6 months have passed since the fall of the Sterling Empire, and the silence in Cypress Creek Estates is different now. It's not the silence of fear, but the quiet of a community finally breathing for the first time in a decade. Victoria is serving 15 years in a federal facility in Fort Worth. Her husband got 10, and her brother is doing 5, and their assets, the Escalade, the house, the offshore accounts, were seized to pay $400,000 in restitution to the neighborhood. We used that money to build the Abernathy Community Center, a gorgeous facility with the pool we were always promised, and Captain Thorne is the new HOA president, though we changed the bylaws so that no one can ever hold power like that again. I'm still in my house. My pool is fixed and clearer than ever, and every Saturday, the neighborhood gathers in my backyard for a barbecue where we don't talk about property values or bylaws, we just talk about life. I survived the serpent of Sugarland, and as I sit here on the edge of the water, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, I realize that the American dream isn't about the lawn or the house. It's about the people who are willing to stand in the dark with you when the monsters come out. But it makes me wonder, how many other Victorias are out there, hiding behind clipboards and manicured hedges? If your neighbor's life was being dismantled in front of you, would you be the one holding the camera or the one holding the manila folder? In a world designed to keep us isolated in our little boxes of suburban perfection, is the greatest act of rebellion simply believing your neighbor instead of the authority that claims to protect you? What would you have done if you were in that crowd? And more importantly, what is your HOA hiding in your basement?
And we are at the end of the videos. I hope you had a great time watching it. If you had any feedback or suggestion for the future videos, drop them in the comment below. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching and see you next time.